here. I'm here today to do my Book of the Month review for the book specially picked by my loving husband, Highland Conqueror by Hannah Howell. As I mentioned in the announcement video, I have read that book before. If I showed you the spine, you'd see how cracked and well read it is. And honestly, it's one of my guilty pleasures, so to speak. I don't speak a lot about it here. A lot of what I read are more contemporary romance, but I have this weird fascination slash love for historical romance, especially historical romance that it's feudal Scotland. I don't know what it is, but especially this specific series about this family, extended family, it just hits the spot for me, and I'm not really sure what it is. It could just be the bare-chested, well-endowed, fit men on the front. So that's all I'm going to kind of say in summary here. I'm now going to move forward and talk a little bit about the plot and some aspects of it. So the plot itself is pretty formulaic, especially when you compare it to other books in this series. You have the pretty lady, you have the Scottish lord, and they have an instant attraction that develops into love over the course of the book. Sometimes it's a short period of time like this one, sometimes it's a longer period of time. Specifically, with this series specifically, what I like is that the women have some amount of agency. They're not really dependent on the men to get everything done. There are certain things they do rely on the men for, but it's usually in relation to what the men have trained all their lives for versus what the women have been trained to do, and you want a professional to do the stuff that's hard. The pacing in the book itself is pretty consistent. This book is over a shorter period of time than some of the other ones, so the pacing is very quick. There's no dragging because the plot is constantly moving forward as every action and every chapter in the book either pushes the story forward or pushes the story forward and also pushes forward the romance. Very rarely do you have too much dwelling on just the romance where the plot stalls. Within that, I'm going to clarify kind of the two arcs. So your main character, the main female protagonist, her name is Jolene. She's an English lady, and she is trying to protect her nephew from her power-hungry cousin. And she was able to do so much on her own, but when she helps rescue the Scottish Lord Sigmar and his comrades in arms, brothers and cousins, which happens in the first chapter of the book, so I'm not spoiling anything. When she releases them, they honor a bond with her now dead brother to take her and her nephew out and protect them from this cousin. And then the other story arc is Jolene and Sigmar falling in love while all of this other stuff is happening. And like I mentioned, this is a shorter time period that the book is spread over, so although I say the pacing is pretty quick and pretty consistent, it doesn't slow down at all towards the end, so the ending ends up feeling really rushed because of that. And I don't find it negative. I like that it has a quick wrap up. They do a short epilogue to kind of let you know everybody ended up where they should and such, but just the ending towards the actual resolution always feels just a little bit rushed. And the plot progression, like I kind of already mentioned, they do a really good job of every chapter moving the story forward, or every chapter moving the story and the romance forward in tandem. Because if they're not dealing with Jolene's power-greedy, power-hungry cousin, they are dealing with other aspects related to him, escaping him, and keeping everybody safe. And that'll lead me to kind of give you some pros and cons here about the plot, the pacing, and the progression. So I'm going to start with the pros. The first one is that you do have the quick pacing, so the book is a very quick and easy read because things are constantly happening. A second pro, which isn't going to be for everybody, but it's for me, the sex was reasonably steamy. Because it's a romance, you know it's kind of coming. They lead up to it with zero subterfuge, so it's not just hinted at. You like, you know it's coming, and you know it's coming pretty early on, so it's not like I'm spoiling anything here for you. But along with that, they also do pair it with some like very sweet moments. Like the book does do a very good job of developing the romance, and I felt very connected. I felt like their connection and their feelings for each other were reasonably believable given the setting. But that leads me to some cons. And one con, I'm not going to mention specifically where it is, but there's like a huge plot hole with a side character, and every time I read it, it makes me angry. And I always forget it when I pick this book up. So I was like, I love this one, it's such a cool story. And then I get to that plot hole, I'm like, oh yeah, this fucking thing happens. And then my other con is that even though it does develop into, like they do have a decent romance development, how quickly they kind of talk about love after they have that kind of insta-lust for each other always feels a little weird to me. But I personally am just not someone who doesn't move that fast and doesn't necessarily believe in like love at first sight. And so there's my pros and cons. I'll move on to the characters, give you a quick little summary of those guys. As I mentioned, your female protagonist is Jolene and your male protagonist is Sigmore. They are both lords, Jolene in England, Sigmore in Scotland. So they're on pretty even footing in terms of status. Jolene, she knows her own mind, she's very opinionated, but she's still like soft and feminine, so she's like kind of like an ideal candidate for like for a romance for me, because she's strong, she knows her own mind, she knows what she can do, and even though it hurts her, she knows when she has to ask for help, which I think is something that's very hard to do, and I recognize that is something I struggle with myself. And then you have a man like Sigmore, who, while masculine and like a smidge possessive, he's not like toxically so, he doesn't prevent her from doing stuff, and he respects her mind and her agency for the most part, so I don't get too upset like when they do like coupley stuff and they fall into more typical gender roles, because like I said, just they're not particularly toxic, even if they're not perfect. I don't feel like the man is abusing her or harassing her in any sense, the way Jolene in any sense. I don't feel like Sigmore is harassing or abusing Jolene in any sense. It's just like a smidge of jealousy to keep things spicy. One other thing I specifically like about this series is that the family relationship are really good. Like the relationship between Jolene and her nephew, Sigmore, and his family, both immediate and extended. And overall, the characters are just really fun. So I'm now going to go into a quick wrap up, and then I'm going to jump into some book club style questions like I typically do. So with the wrap up, I know I just said a bunch of like really awesome things about this book, but ultimately I'm giving it a 3.5 out of 5. I enjoyed it, and I enjoyed it more than the average book. It's definitely it was one of the first books in the series I read, and reading it was definitely the reason I continued to read other books in this series. Because like I said, I do really enjoy the woman who knows their mind, has agency, even if she doesn't have the ability to do everything, and that the man both trusts her and like recognizes her ability to be her own person. The story itself is cute, it's fun, minus like the power-hungry cousin. It's like pretty, just like a fun little adventure that you go on, and you get to watch these two people fall in love in weird circumstances. Characters are all fun to follow. The romantic relationship is like reasonably healthy. There's not like red flags going up left and right where I'm like, what the fuck is going on? And the family relationships are just, the dynamics there are just really well represented. I really do enjoy this series. It's like called the Murray Family series, I think. So if anybody likes historical romance and specifically doesn't mind steamy scenes and feudal Scotland, I really recommend this series because the men are strong and gentle and the women are strong and gentle. And with that, I will leave kind of the spoiler, like the more spoiler-free portion here, and I will jump into the book club questions where I will pull no spoiler punches. Alrighty, so to finish off with The Highland Conqueror by Hannah Howell, I will proceed to answer 6 book club questions that I typically do with every book that I do this kind of review for. The first one is, what is your initial reaction? My initial reaction is interest, because they note the Insta attraction right away, and from the first page, I was really intrigued because on top of the Insta attraction, she's looking at a bunch of smelly men who have been kind of stuck in their, what they wrote in on for a few days in a dungeon. So it started off with a bang, like it was a pretty solid cold open. Question 2, what is your favorite chapter or scene? For me specifically, I personally quite enjoy the scene where Jolene actually declares her love for Sycamore. She had kind of recognized it internally in her, with the monologues that you read, her internal monologues that you read. But the first time she says it, she does it just in the most spectacular fashion of questioning her sanity, dumping her bowl of food on his head, and then leaving the room, because it certainly feels like that sometimes. Question 3 is, how did the characters change throughout the book? There wasn't a lot of change. Like, Jolene and Sycamore fall in love and kind of recognize what a healthy relationship with them would kind of entail. But it takes over such a short period of time that really nobody does too much changing. Jolene is probably the closest, because she does struggle a lot internally with picking her love for Sycamore over her love for Reynard, her nephew. And while ultimately she does choose Sycamore, like, the struggle and the thought process behind how she gets there was, like, oddly satisfying for me. It wasn't just, oh, it's a once-in-a-lifetime love, I have to go with this. She really struggled, and I really liked the way it played out. And as such, I would say she grew the most dealing with that struggle. Question 4. How did you like the ending? Other than being a bit rushed, I quite enjoyed it. Like I said in the previous question, the logic behind the decision made by the main female protagonist, Jolene, was, like, really satisfying and felt really logical and thought through. And it just had the typical kind of historical romance vibe of sweet, tidy, and happy endings, and I'm okay with that sometimes, because it's not that people didn't die that should have died. Some people died along the way. It was all good. Question 5, would you read another book by this author? Yes, and in fact, I've read several books by this author already, and I reread them pretty regularly. Like I said, it is my guilty pleasure, and I just really enjoy the way she writes her plots and characters. They are somewhat formulaic, but it's a formula I'm okay with, because it usually leaves me with a palatable story and no distaste over how characters are treating each other. And question 6, does this book remind you of any other book? It reminds me of every other book written by this author, but in a good way. So any of this Murray family series, I would totally recommend if you enjoy historical romances with, like, reasonably healthy relationships and no, like, weird abuse that is tolerated and, like, accepted by characters in the book. So with that, I'll kind of wrap it up here. If you've read any of this series, let me know below what you think. If you've read this book, let me know what you think. Tell me if I'm way off base. I'm curious to hear what you guys think. And I'll see you guys in the next video. Bye.